Oral implants today are often presented in forms of spring and autumn collections. We have forgotten about clinical trials, right? What we have seen now is some sort of spitting out new models of implants almost every bloody year. And the lamentable situation is that those seem to be very popular for customers are buying them all the time, and the dentists seem to have stopped asking for any clinical trials. They trust companies. And with the exception of today, when we, of course, trust Astrotech because they are hosts, you can never trust a commercial company. Because, as you will see here, it isn't such that, that we have seen all implant systems working after the advent of osseointegration. It is not the same as success. You can fail with osseointegrated implants too. And I will give you a cavalcade here of commonly used oral implant systems that have caused enormous human suffering. And I'm starting here with the Corvent system. Not so commonly used here, but in the United States, it had around 1990, 35% market share, an absolutely dreadful implant system that hadn't been documented at all, but indeed it was osseointegrated. If you call this, you see bone tissue here, and you see the metal here, and it seems to be a direct contact. But that is not equivalent to implant success. Then followed one single study of only 47 implants in a few patients, demonstrating that the actual success rate of this horrible implant was down to about 9%. 3 months later, it was withdrawn from sales immediately. And since it was such a popular device, you can imagine how many patients who have lost jawbone and suffered tremendously. But that isn't alone. Here you have an aluminum oxide implant, the Frealit 1 implant, that started fracturing. And although they showed osseointegration too, as you can see here, in this image here, and they worked well for 1 or 2 or 3 years. They started fracturing in great numbers, and between 5 and 10 years after placement, 70% of them fractured. And that was a German implant system, but there was a Japanese one, also with aluminum oxides, ceramics, that showed enormously high failure rates, and it's believed that 200,000 of those implants were placed in patients in Japan, quite unnecessarily. And really, a lot of patients had to be operated and the implants removed. So these are dreadful situations that we see, and that is why, ladies and gentlemen, to this day, I'm very skeptical when I now see that some companies try to spit out zirconia implants on the market. I can't prove that they won't work. We know that they have worked reasonably well as abutments in the soft tissues, but we don't know if they work and take the load in the bone anchorage portion. We have only very limited clinical follow-up, and if there are problems with fractures, you will see those after perhaps 5 to 10 years. So I think proceed with caution. I would warn you today of using any type of ceramic implant for bone anchorage. IMZ, another popular cylindrical implant, that had a market share in the United States of 15% and was very popular in Germany. Again showed problems with bone loss. Here you have time on the x-axis, up to 7 years. Here you have bone loss in millimeters, -1, -2. And you see these implants. These are averages from a paper published by Dietrich and Wagner in the German Implant Journal in 1992. You can see that they lost a lot of bone in the first year, 1.5 millimeter on an average. But they continued losing bone every year. And this is a very alarming curve, because even if survival rates at 5 years still may be good, because they have now only lost on an average 2.5 millimeters, after 5 years, the bone resorption accelerated in these cases, because now they've started to be slightly movable, these implants, right? And then the results in the maxilla at 10 years or more was published later on as 13%. Horrible clinical outcome. The IMZ implants disappeared from the market 10 years ago, in 1997. They should never have been introduced in the first place. We were too uncritical in buying them and placing them, and our patients suffered a lot, those of us who used them, and trusted that they were also integrated. First generation of HA-coated implants, similar problems, a lot of bone loss. presumably due to that the coat came loose, and you then had a lot of inflammatory reactions and bone resorption. They disappeared too from the market. This is the first generation of HA-coated implants. And then now we are in the new millennium. And of course, now we have no problems. The problem is that we do have problems also in the new millennium. But you can trust the major companies. You cannot. You will soon say why. First, a small company, the Oraltronics double screw. An absolutely horrible device. Actually, when I was here 15 years ago, there was some, if you excuse the expression, untrained but very verbally active German implantologist who stood here in Taipei and recommended this absolutely horrible implant design. And I came up after him and I said, never place it, I said. Don't trust the man who spoke before me, because he's not telling the truth. He has no clinical records. And then later on we got the clinical records. 350 patients in Norway sued their dentist. He lost his license to work as a dentist. And a similar number in Denmark sued their dentist. This dentist committed suicide. You know, it isn't easy if you believe too much in clinical companies. And now we come to the largest company in the world. And we are now talking about the Noble Direct implant, an absolutely horrible device that was marketed very bluntly by the largest company in the world. We tried to warn them secretly when we started seeing very bad results in 2005, and they decided not to listen. So we had then 550 consecutively placed such implants at 18 centers in Europe and the United States. They were touted as the great success of the new millennium by the company. 1/3 of them showed either failure or more than 3 millimeters of bone loss at 1 to 1.5 years after placement, which is a dramatically poor clinical result, of course. They looked absolutely dreadful, and the company decided there were no problems. They just claimed that these professors, they always exaggerate, and come and buy them. And then they had a clinical recommendation, which I think was the most harmful thing. The implant per se. If you place this very conservatively, I think you can have actually reasonably good results with it. Like with any other tapered implant, with some caution, you may overtalk it, but if used by trained hands in a conservative manner, you can have good clinical results with it. But that wasn't recommended by the company. The company said, you place them, then you grind them down in situ. Then when you grind down with some sort of diamond burr, you will cause not only heat, but also vibration, right, of the implant. And then they said, now you can load it immediately. And if you have an implant that has already vibrated itself half loose, right, and you then load it directly, here is the outcome. The company refused to accept that there were any problems still.